Good evening. You're listening to Christian Media Trust on South East Radio. My name is Jarlath Glynn, and this programme is the second in a four-part series on the War of Independence in County Wexford. It is brought to you by Wexford County Council Library Service as part of the commemoration of the Decade of Centenaries. Casualties in the War of Independence in County Wexford were not as large as in other counties such as Kerry and Tipperary. In all, 23 people were killed. The greatest loss of life took place in St. Kearns Saltmills when 5 volunteers were killed in a munitions explosion on October the 12th, 1920. Another 9 were wounded. One of these was John Timmons, and I am joined now by his granddaughter, Mairead Timmons. Mairead, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Jarlath. It's a pleasure.
To begin with, can you tell me where your grandfather came from and his family background?
Okay. My grandfather came from County Carlow, from St. Mullins, from the townsland of Oulart. He was the youngest of 10. He was born in 1882.
And he married?
He did. He married a lady by the name of Margaret Brophy. And Margaret was born in Wexford town in 1897, the daughter of an RIC sergeant.
And there were a number of RIC men in the family.
There was. Her father was an RIC sergeant, and on her mother's side, she had 2 uncles from County Tipperary that were also involved in the RIC.
You mentioned to me before that she spent some time in Clifford Street in Wexford,
yes.
And other RIC men lived in Clifford Street
yes.
as well.
And this is just something that I've just recently become aware of, that my grandmother was born in Clifford Street. Until recently, I thought she was born in the RIC station in Tintern, as her brothers were born there. But she was born in Clifford Street because her father was based in the RIC station in South Main Street in Wexford, and then he was transferred and promoted to Tintern.
And when did your grandfather, John, join the IRA?
I'm a little bit hazy on that. I'm not really sure when my grandfather moved from County Carlow to Wexford, because in the 1911 census he stated in his residence as being in Oulart. The earliest records I have him as his involvement is, I think he joined in 1917 in Duncannon.
He was involved, I know, in a daring raid on Hook Lighthouse. That secured a lot of explosives.
Yes, he was. And there was a numerous raids on the Hook Lighthouse. One was where the ammunition was raided from the Hook and brought in escorting and subsequently moved back down to the Saltmills area. But my grandfather had been involved in one in March or April of 1920, where a large stash of Tintin was acquired in out of the lighthouse, and that was stored in the Saltmills area for the purpose of making bombs.
And why were there so many explosives in the Hook Lighthouse?
It had to do with some piece of equipment that was used for the foghorn. It's not my area of expertise, but I think that's what it was used for. It was used in the making of the flares for going into the foghorn, or for notifying ships of danger.
To warn ships of danger. What always fascinates me is, how were the IRA members trained in the use of arms? Where did that take place, or how was it done? Again,
we just have to go by witness statements and family stories. They trained and they drilled. I know that they drilled on the green in Ballycalan and in the fields, and then they had a munitions factory in St. Kearns. But because they were in the production of explosives to be shipped around the country, a gentleman of the name of Joe McMahon from Clare actually came to give them instruction in the manufacturing of bombs in the during the summer of 1920.
I've heard of his name before somewhere.
You have, yes. I think he was involved in the assassination of Inspector Lee Wilson and Gorey. And Joe subsequently died in a bomb explosion in Cavan in August 1920. So,
now, I said earlier that the number of casualties was not as large in County Wexford. But there were a lot of raids and burnings of RAC barracks. Was your grandfather involved in those?
He was, and he was involved in cutting wires and digging trenches and robbing trains and things like that. A lot of the RIC barracks in the Saltmills area were vacated at the time, so they were burning in them or what. But there was nobody there. I know there was a couple of major raids on the Clonroach RIC station, Fox's Mills and Duncannon. But I don't think there was any major casualties. I think they got in and did what they did and went home again.
I think a lot of the RIC men moved in from the country, from rural areas to Wexford town.
Or into New Ross, yeah.
We come to the centre of the story. What happened on the night of October the 12th in St. Kieran's, Saltmills?
On the night of that night in October, there was a crowd of individuals gathered in a derelict house in St. Kieran's on the coast, just outside Saltmills, for the purposes of making bombs and packing them into butter boxes. There are different accounts of what happened that night, but what did happen was that the material that they were using, the gun cotton, was very highly explosive, and the premises that they were in, because it was at darkness and they didn't want to be recognised or whatever, the windows were blacked out, so it was a very tight area, very combustible, and a spark occurred. And my grandfather could see the blue flame running across the floor and shouted at the other gentlemen, "Run." But they did run, but unfortunately they didn't run quickly enough, and the whole place exploded. And the people that were killed suffered horrendous wounds. My grandfather's clothes were fully blown off. He was met walking down the road with Michael Conway in a very dishevelled, disorientated state after the explosion.
Now, that event must have had a huge effect on morale in the county.
It must have had, and I know that Michael Collins was aware in the following days of the explosion and the fact that there had been casualties and fatalities, and that the other people involved had been arrested and taken to jails around the southeast. So it was a major event, and also bearing in mind it's a very rural area. So when the explosion occurred, the noise must have been heard at a great distance.
And I'm sure there were huge repercussions.
Yes, there was, because my grandfather, when he came to live in Poundtown, which is just outside of the gates of Tintern Abbey, his sister, who had emigrated to America, and her fiancé, who had been killed in a shunting accident, had returned to Ireland, and she came to live with her brother John. And when he was arrested and imprisoned, the Black and Tans raided the premises on numerous occasions, and she had a very traumatic time, as you know, that they were trying to keep the pressure up and show the force of the Crown in the area.
Where exactly was your grandfather imprisoned?
My grandfather initially was taken to Dr. Furlong's infirmary here in Wexford town, where he spent a few days. And initially there had been a daring plot for him to himself and Michael Conway to be sprung with the help of the John o' God nuns, and to be taken to Dr. James Ryan TD's home in Wicklow with the help of the South Carlow Battalion. But it didn't come to fruition, and then he was taken to Waterford Infirmary and into Waterford Jail. But some of the other gentlemen had a much more traumatic experience. They were taken to Cork Jail and used as human shields by the army and the auxiliaries during the movement of military equipment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandfather then, after the court-martial, they were sentenced to 3 years hard labour, and they were taken initially to Mountjoy to be processed. And that was another very traumatic experience, because the the Black and Tans raided that, and then they were moved to the North Wall, and he spent 15 months in Portland prison, and then they were moved on to Dartmoor.
How did this come down in folklore in your family or in your family's history? For example, I knew your grandmother. Did she talk about your grandfather's involvement in the War of Independence?
Never.
And why do you think that was?
Well, maybe it's because, I don't know, maybe because they eloped subsequently after, in 1923, and there was, caused problems within her family and her family connection. I'm not sure. Or maybe it was just too traumatic, and he suffered the consequences of the explosion in his later life, and that had a very traumatic, he had wounds that were still there ongoing. But no, she never talked about it. The only thing, there was a photograph that hung in our sitting room of 6 men, and I would look at it every day as I passed by and wondered who they were. Little did I know that one of the people in the photograph was my grandfather. And about 15 or 16 years ago, I actually finally found out who the men were. And it turned out to be the men that had been interred in England. And it was taken in De Vere's photography studio here in Wexford on their return.
And had they descendants?
No.
None at all?
No. My grandfather was the only one that married. And the interesting fact was that he was much older than the rest of them. And so he was 38 at the time of the explosion, and he died when he was in 1949 at the age of 69, leaving a wife and 7 sons.
Thank you very much for sharing that
welcome.
Fascinating story with me. It really is a marvellous story.
It is.
Now we'll take a short musical break. This piece is from Sean O'Riada, The Bhí Banúsal. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, you're listening to Christian Media Trust on South East Radio. My name is Jarlath Glynn, and this programme is the second in a 4-part series on the War of Independence in County Wexford. I'm joined now by Brian Ó Cléirigh. He is in the process of completing a thesis on the Lacy family from Oulart in NUI Galway. He hopes to have it published before Christmas as a contribution to the commemoration of the revolutionary period. He's already written what the late Richard Roach described as the definitive history of the Battle of Oulart Hill. Brian, fáilte rót go dtí an clár.
Jarlath.
Can you give us a brief introduction to the family? Who are the Lacy family and why are they so important?
Well, the Lacys are an old Oulart family living on a small farm on the edge of the village, and their roots in the area go back well before parish records begin and well before 98. They changed their name to the Lacy in 1911 as an expression of the cultural revival that had taken place in the country, or was taking place, and of which they were an important part in the Oulart area. There were 4 siblings in the family, Michael, Annie, Ned and Larry. Michael the eldest and Larry the youngest, and all 4 were involved in politics and in the cultural politics of the time.
Now, Larry went towards journalism.
Yes, Larry was encouraged towards journalism by his teacher, Robert Lawless of Ballygarrett in the National School in Oulart. A very astute man, obviously. And from an early age he directed him in that direction. Even as a pupil in the school, he had him writing in the Weekly Independent in the young person's page in that weekly newspaper in Dublin.
It was the Echo he was involved with?
Oh, he was involved with many papers. His first, he was taken up by the Echo. Mr. Sears, the owner of the Echo, or the major shareholder, actually came out to Oulart on his bike and asked the father and Larry would he be interested in joining the paper after he had finished his schooling in Enniscorthy. And when he left, Larry was an employee of the Echo, and it began a lifelong career in journalism, usually in an editorial capacity. He was the first editor of the Irish Volunteer, the IRB paper. Larry was a major IRB figure in the central Wexford area. He was the head centre of the IRB in Enniscorthy. And from that, of course, he was deputy editor of the Echo, which was the first local paper in Ireland to become pro-Sinn Féin in 1907 after the failure of the Council Bill. And he was later, of course, editor of newspapers in America and Ireland. In Ireland, including the Drogheda Argus, the Connacht Tribune, and the Clare Champion, where he retired. And people, particularly people of my age, will remember in particular his daily little column in the Independent, which ran for 37 years on nature study, called If You Watch Today by Fieldman. And actually, on his headstone in St. Mary's Cemetery in Enniscorthy, Fieldman is specially mentioned there.
That's a nice touch,
He was
isn't it?
very proud of it, yeah.
And his brother Michael then was in education. He was a teacher.
Michael, when Larry was in school, Michael, who was 8 years older, was already what you might call a jam teacher, in between Father Hugh Byrne's grandfather, Father Hugh Byrne of Blackwater today. His grandfather moved from the school as principal to Ballindagan with his wife. Both of them moved to Ballindagan, and where they were married. And in the interim between Mr. Lawless succeeding him, Larry's brother Michael was a teacher.
And he went to Australia.
We next find him teaching with the Augustinians in 1905 in Australia, in a big college there in Bathurst in New South Wales, very famous college in Australia.
What brought him there, Brian?
I'm not able to explain. I don't know and cannot find out how he got his training. Whether the Augustinians assisted, with the help maybe of the local parish priest, Father Kenny, that this man was a man of exceptionally high intelligence. There is no question about that. It's authenticated by several witnesses to the fact, and maybe he pushed him ahead. But from Australia he came back. He came back in 1909. He had heard that Tom Clark had returned to Ireland from New York, and he wasn't going to miss anything that might happen. And he came back to Ireland, and the Augustinians employed him as principal in Good Counsel in New Ross. And from there, he became principal of the Enniscorthy Vocational School, or Technical School as it was then. And some years after that, around 1914, he became manager of the Labour Exchange in Enniscorthy, but also ran his own private commercial school in Wafer Street.
And then he moved to Limerick, I think, was it?
Yeah, well, after the Rising.
After the Rising.
And after a year in Dartmoor. He was in the leadership cadre in Dartmoor, and they were the last to get out, July in 1917. And incidentally, he was one of the men that signed the letter to Congress in America, 25 leaders from across the country. He then found that he had to get a job because he was married, and he got a job in Limerick Technical Institute. That's a big institute in Limerick with 7 different schools and a very wide field of activities, even then. And there he was at loggerheads immediately with the Department of Education because of his political record. And he resisted it. And he said that if he can't be employed for holding his political views, that there was something immoral about that for him as a member of society. And he got the backing and the strong backing of the City Council and the trade unions in the city. And he held on the job. And eventually in 1919, late 1919, August, Dáil Éireann took it over, the first institution in Ireland ever taken over by Dáil Éireann. And Michael himself actually addressed a committee of Dáil Éireann in the process. That time they didn't have the special purpose committees like now. The whole house was the committee.
And then he moved up the ladder in the civil service. He reached the top.
Yeah, well, once Michael was, as I think you know, that he was brigadier of the Mid-Limerick Brigade in Limerick as well. And that was a very difficult situation because Limerick was very split because they hadn't rose in the Rising in 1916, and it left the city in a situation of great disagreement. And he was sent there, I think, to solve that, being an outsider and having standing as one of the condemned men. But the most he could do was to hold the line, because several of the men on the city council were members of the city battalion that hadn't risen. And they had good reason, which was, of course, Fianna. So after some time, his standing was quite high, and W.T. Cosgrave called him to Dublin to become an organiser to set up the Department of Local Government under the Dáil, the new department. And Michael de Lacy set up the inspectorate.
There were 2 other members of the family. Annie, often we don't hear about the women in Irish history.
Couldn't agree more, and it is with great regret the more I tried to study for this project, you really feel it is very, very unfair, because they were taking very high risks a lot of the time and were willing to take anything that was asked, to do anything, whatever was necessary. They're great at the short-range business. They'll do whatever needs to be done. And Annie's story is lost. All I can find are generalities, that she supported coming them on and everything national all her life. But she married Joe Hyland in Borelia and in Glenbryan. And Joe was a volunteer and IRB man. And can't go into it now, but Annie typified, we'll say, the numberless mothers, wives and sisters of activists who took serious risks on a regular basis.
And then just briefly, the other brother,
Edward. Ned stayed at home in Oulart, and he was a key figure in initiating things in Oulart. He initiated the Gaelic League in Oulart. He called the first meeting. He was also the officer commanding the first company of volunteers. He was also a member in some way that I don't quite understand. He was very much in one of the Enniscorthy companies. And I can't say how many Oulart men he brought with him to the rising, but he himself was there from before it started. He was there from the Sunday till Sunday. Mm-hmm. And when he left, he brought 7 guns with him home to Oulart, which he kept for a couple of years till they were wanted.
Now, just a little bit more detail, but not too much, on the contribution of Michael and Larry during the revolutionary period.
Michael was an administrator at heart, even though he had the rank of lieutenant and was armed. Michael was civic minister during the rising, and he shared in forming the policies of the Republic, but he was the one that was the executor to carry them out on the ground, while the other men looked after the military side. He set up the police force, took charge of food distribution and procurement of bedding, etc. in the town, and with the help of Cumann, of course. He closed all the pubs, and generally speaking, his work was very successful in all that regard. His death sentence was commuted, and he went to Dartmoor.
Larry then?
Well, Larry was already after fleeing the country because he had to get out in 1915. His house in Enniscorthy was found to be a minor arsenal of munitions, including explosives. And he was also under suspicion of being in contact with Germany. And this is a harbinger of things to come, because Larry was very much involved in international revolution, particularly in India, with German help.
He became involved at some stage with Harry Boland, didn't he?
Yes, after the failure of what was called the Indo-German-Irish conspiracy in San Francisco, they had planned to send 40,000 rifles per month to India to feed the revolution there. He was jailed for 18 months, and when he got out, Boland sent a message. He lived in a place called Lagunitas. Boland sent a message, and Larry went on to New York, and he was a key figure in the Thompson gun affair. And as you know, 495 guns were seized by the authorities.
Well, you've told us a lot about the de Lacy family. What do you think their legacy is?
Well, Larry's legacy is much more obvious and apparent among journalists, for instance, than elsewhere. And in the case of both of them is the reason I'm trying to write a bit of a book, that I feel that men like them, and there are several cases of people like them and families like them where the whole family was involved. You need go no further than the Mourns of Enniscorthy. They have had no publicity. The publicity focuses on the front row. Mm-hmm. The second row men are left out, and I think that the story doesn't really solidify until you have their efforts, as far as you can ascertain them, included.
Well, Brian, thank you for telling us all that information. It's very, very interesting. Do join us again next week for another programme on the War of Independence in County Wexford at 8:30 next Monday.
This programme was produced by the Christian Media Trust, exclusively for South East Radio.